Hey everybody, how you doing? So we're going to continue talking about mode of production and Marx's analysis of history, his historical materialism. If you look back here, you see that's my dog Zombie, fast asleep. I do when she reacts to my lectures the same way you guys do, so it puts her right to sleep. Anyway. Okay, we're continuing to talk about mode of production. So what we need to do in this segment is I'm going to give you examples from Marx of modes of production and explain what they are. But we want to recap a little bit, right? So, the mode of production to Marx is the way, right, that human beings organize their economic life. And to him, that's the most important thing defining a society, since, right, men must be in a position to live in order to make history. It's essential. All right. So we said that these modes of production are made up of three dimensions. We have the means of production, which are like the tools and utensils and resources and so forth that are used in the process of production. We have the forces of production, which are basically technology, all the knowledge, all the know-how about how to do things, about how to put those means of production into motion, how to apply them. All right. So if the means of production are, plows and draft animals, then maybe the forces of production are agricultural, right? Agriculture. Okay. So we have the means of production, we have the forces of production, then we have the relations of production. And the relations of production are all of the social arrangements that people establish, right, around the process of production. The entire way in which people socially organize production. So that can include the division of labor, right? And that can also include, most importantly to Marx, as we will see, the concept of class, okay, social classes and class arrangements, and how important those are in defining the logic, right, according to which these different modes of production are going to operate. Okay, so that's how we define mode of production. Now we're going to give some examples. When Marx looks at history, what examples of modes of production does he see? So here's my improvised blackboard here. So we're going to have, let's see, I got to get here, primitive communism, right? The ancient or slave mode of production, feudalism, and capitalism. Those are the ones we've seen so far. And then he's going to speculate, right? Or he's going to argue for the possibility of the transition, or maybe I should say the transcendence, right, of capitalism into a brand new mode of production where classes are abolished, called socialism. And then that gives way to communism. These things lie in the future, and Marx wasn't necessarily very clear about what he meant by communism. Certainly, I think when he talks about socialism, he is talking about the first mode of production after capitalism that doesn't rely on class exploitation, and one in which there is a state that defends and represents the interests not of the owners, right, but of the working class. Okay, it's based on community ownership, social ownership of the means of production, not private ownership of the means of production, and where the political institution defends the interests of the working class. Okay, now we're not going to say a whole lot about that. We are going to talk a little bit about Marx's theory of revolution, right? But we're not going to talk so much about that. I want to focus on these modes of production and focus most attention in the next segment after this one on his criticism of capitalism. So if you look at those three in the middle, ancient, right, feudalism and capitalism, those are class-based, right? And then you have primitive communism and you have socialism and communism, right, which are not class-based, okay? All right. Now, the way we can look at these is, again, we can think of them as different types of social formations. One society is distinct from another society according to its mode of production, or we can look at them as stages, right? Stages of development, stages of historical development, right? Toward capitalism, okay? These are the ones, I think, that would explain the rise of capitalism in Europe, all right? And so they are not necessarily inevitable. They're not necessarily inevitable stages for every society around the world, because, he does talk about, when he looks at places like China, when he looks at places like Asia, he does talk about something called the Asiatic mode of production, which is unique, right, to that situation. So here we go. Let me put this down. Okay. And I'm actually going to pause. Okay, so I'm back. So we have the primitive mode of production, we have the ancient slave mode of production, and we have feudalism and capitalism. So let's look at those a little bit and talk about what they are, how they look different from each other. The primitive mode of production, right? I think when he's talking about the primitive mode of production, he's talking about the primitive communism, as he calls it, primitive communism. The word communism should be kind of a hint there, right? These are classless societies, societies without class, okay? Without class distinctions. And the reason for that is because they are subsistence economies, right? They're subsistence economies. They're economies where people are not able to produce a surplus for whatever reason that might be. They're not able to produce and accumulate a surplus. So their limitations could be technological, they could be environmental, it could be a lot of different reasons why they aren't able to accumulate a surplus. The means of production are basically centered around the use of different kinds of hand tools, right? And like I said, these are subsistence economies where everybody now has to work. Everybody is engaged directly in production. They participate, right, in production. And in terms of forces of production, and these would include, things like hunting and gathering society, horticultural society, certain kinds of subsistence agriculture societies, okay, small-scale farming societies, where people are not accumulating a surplus, and they are classless societies. They're egalitarian. So that egalitarianism is important, and it gets reflected in other institutions, right? Like political life. If we were looking at a hunting and gathering society, political decisions are more or less shared by everybody. Everybody participates in the making of these decisions that affect the entire group, and everybody is participating equally in production, and everybody is getting their share, right? They're getting their fair share of what society produces. So that's why he's calling it primitive communism. Okay, now, by the time we get to the ancient mode of production, right, which is also called the slave mode of production, well, that's an important word, right, slavery. So these are societies, right, that come into being with agriculture. So, what's the big difference between agriculture and, let's say, hunting and gathering? Well, the big difference is that now you have a technology where people can accumulate a surplus, and they're storing a surplus. And that makes a lot of things possible. So the first thing it means is, well, if we can produce and accumulate and store a surplus, it means not everybody has to work in food production. And because not everybody has to work in food production, that means that we can get a much more refined and much more specialized division of labor. Okay, but something else happens, right, in this type of society. This is the first society in human history, according to Marx, that is grounded in and defined by the exploitation of one class over another. All right, and without going into a whole big long discussion of it, classes emerge when one group in society, somebody other than the people I'm going to call the direct producers. And who are the direct producers? The people that actually do the work, right? So somebody other than the direct producers gets control of that surplus, and they control it and they own it, right, as their own private wealth. Okay, everybody get that? And then their wealth and their privilege in society is maintained, right, through the exploitation of another class. So in terms of class relationships, the definitive relationship of the ancient mode of production is the relationship between masters and slaves. Okay, masters and slaves. So think about ancient Greece. Think about ancient Rome. Okay, right. So you have masters and slaves. Okay. Now you have the thing about Marx is he's going to tell us there are other classes, right? There are other classes. So if we were looking at ancient Rome, there's masters and slaves, but then there's also a class of free laborers, like day laborers, and there's also a class of merchants, and there's a priesthood. It could be argued that they occupy a separate class, all right? So there's other classes, but every society has one class relationship that is definitive of it. Defines that society for what it is, defines its logic. Okay. So in ancient or slave mode of production, we get masters and slaves. That is the definitive relationship of that ancient mode of society. And remember, we got base and we have superstructure, right? So superstructure, what does that produce? It produces a state. Okay, it produces a certain kind of state. Marx is going to tell us that the state comes into being historically when you have classes, right? When you have class society, that's when societies develop states. Because what the state represents, right, to Marx, is the organization of the political power of the privileged class. Okay, everybody follow me here? The organization of the political power of that ruling class, of that dominant class. And so the state then gets used, right, to maintain their interests. They create laws that represent their interests, and they are able to exert coercive power, right, to keep people in line. And they're able to generate ideologies to convince people that everything is the way it should be, or it can't be any different, or things like that. Okay. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But I want you to understand that relationship between class and state here. Okay. Marx said that the state is nothing more than an apparatus through which one class oppresses another. And that's another important thing. You want to remember that to Marx, class is always a relationship of exploitation. Okay? And I'm going to read you a quote from the Communist Manifesto by the time we get done here, all right, where he's going to tell us that. Okay. So then, now we move on. We go to feudalism. So primitive communism gives way to feudalism. Marx said that every society contains the seeds of its own destruction. That was one of his more famous quotes, right? Every society, every social formation, every mode of production, right, contains the seeds of its own destruction. And what he was talking about there was something that he called contradictions. Every mode of production, every society has built into it these structural contradictions. Now, what those are basically problems. Right? These are problems. These are inconsistencies. These are tensions that are built into that system. And for as long as the society can resolve its own contradictions, then it gets what we would call reproduced, right? But if those contradictions get out of hand, if they get too big, if they get too deep, right? These societies reach a breaking point where they collapse kind of under their own weight. And then a new kind of society emerges to take its place. So primitive communism emerged out of the, I'm not going to, again, get into the details, but I'll just say this, right? That the ancient slave mode of production emerged out of the contradictions, right, of primitive communism. And the contradictions of the contradictions of ancient slave mode of production finally lead to its collapse. I think of the collapse of the Roman Empire, right? And give rise to feudalism in Europe. And then capitalism is going to emerge out of the collapse of feudalism, when it can no longer handle its own contradictions. It's going to fall apart and lead to capitalism. And then he's going to argue that capitalism is no different than modes of production that came before it. It has its own contradictions that we'll point out when we get to our analysis of capitalism. But capitalism has its own contradictions, right? And, when capitalism reaches the point where it can't control or it can't maintain itself, can't keep patching the walls up, right, it's going to collapse. And it's going to give way to feudalism. I'm getting tired. It's going to give way to socialism. Okay. Whew. Okay. All right. Everybody all right? I didn't mean to confuse you there. All right. So ancient slave mode of production, surplus producing, means of production, land, right? Plows, water wheels, draft animals, okay? And so on, right? Mills, forces of production, agriculture, all right? Relations of production, masters and slaves, all right? We get to feudalism, okay? Feudalism, another mode of production, agricultural, means of production, land, draft animals, mills, right? Different relations of production, right? Different relations of production. Now it's the relationship between landlords and serfs, right? Between lords and serfs. And, they are in a relationship where the serfs are tied to the land, they're held to the land, and the privileged class of landowners, okay, forces or compels them to tithe them or pay them tribute, okay? So the privileged class maintains its position of privilege by compelling serfs to produce wealth that's then appropriated by that privileged class. And that's how privileged classes work. They appropriate the wealth produced by the class that isn't privileged, okay? The masters appropriate the wealth produced by the slaves, and the landlords appropriate the wealth produced by the serfs, all right, in the form of feudal rent and so on. Now those two, slavery and serfdom, are ultimately based on coercion, okay? Physical coercion. Um, here's the deal, okay? Here's the deal. You know, how do classes work? What are classes? Well, first of all, we can talk about them as a structural relationship. Who owns the means of production and who doesn't? The class that controls the means of production controls society, okay? And the class that doesn't own the means of production doesn't control society, right? And that class is a relationship. It's a relation. You can't have one class without another, right? There are no landlords without serfs, and there are no serfs without landlords, and there are no masters without slaves, and there are no slaves without masters. It's a relationship, all right? And to put this in my own words, right, the way class works for Marx is like this. Class is a situation where I get you to work for me and not for yourself, right? So that's the entire basis of class. How do I get you to work for me and not for yourself? Well, if you think about slavery, how do I get you to work for me and not for yourself? Work for me or I will kill you, right? That's it. It's coercion. It's coercion. Same is true with feudalism, because who are those landlords? Those landlords are, they're a military class, right? Originally, they're a military class. These are heavily armed, badass dudes, right? And they are able to essentially compel through the threat of force serfs to cough it up, right? The way feudalism works is a lot like the way the mafia works. Think about the payment of protection, right, to the local mafia don. All you got to do is watch the second episode, the second version, the sequel, the first sequel to The Godfather, Godfather 2. Watch The Godfather 2, and you'll understand the way feudalism works. Okay. Organized crime is basically feudalism, right? Everybody get that? All right. Capitalism is going to be a little bit different, okay? And I'm going to save our a whole different discussion to talk about capitalism, because that's the whole point that we're trying to get to, is Marx's critique, Marx's analysis of, and his criticism of capitalism, okay? I'm going to pause here for just a second, so hold on. Okay, I'm back. So I wanted to sort of close this part of our discussion with a quote from the Communist Manifesto. It's one of the very first things that Marx says in the Communist Manifesto. So the first thing he says is this. He says, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. Right? Here, put it up here for you. See if you can read that. All right, it's a little dark, but see if you can read that. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Okay? So what's the thing that drives history? Is this history is this constant story of the struggle and the conflict between classes, okay? Then he says this. He gives some examples of historical class relationships, okay? So he says freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed. I'm going to stop right there. Okay? Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, that's an old way of saying, in other words, right? In other words, oppressor and oppressed. Whenever you talk about class, it's a relationship, and it's an oppressive relationship. Class is always a relationship where one group is oppressing another, where the privileged position of a class in society is maintained on the backs of an oppressed class, right? Like I said, the landlords, their privilege in society is maintained through their constant exploitation of serfs. It's where their wealth comes from, right? The wealth of the slave owners and their position of privilege comes from their constant exploitation of slaves, okay? So let's read some more. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, right? So in other words, classes are always in conflict with each other, okay? By definition, they're in conflict with each other, okay? That conflict isn't always raging as like war, class war, but it's always kind of bubbling there beneath the surface. Because class means that my interests as a member of a class is going to be different than your interests as a member of a class, right? If I'm a slave owner, if I'm a master, what's in my interest? My interest is to keep you a slave. My interest is to maintain the system under which I am privileged. Okay? And as a slave, what is in your historical interest should be the overthrow or the abolition of the conditions under which you are exploited. Okay? So classes are always in conflict with each other. All right? So they stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. This is what drives history to Marx, is this class conflict, okay? The main contradiction of any of these societies, ancient slave, feudalism, and capitalism, right? The main contradiction of them are going to be the real contradictions between class lines, okay? They're going to be the fault lines, right? Like, think about like plate tectonics, okay, where you have these plates that are like pushing against each other under enormous pressure, and you don't always see it. It's under the surface, right? And you don't always see it. But once in a while, things get so bad, the pressure builds up so much that, the plates break and they slide past each other, and that causes an earthquake, right? And it changes the landscape. Okay. So out of the class contradictions of ancient society comes feudalism. And out of the class contradictions of feudalism comes capitalism. And out of the class contradictions of capitalism, according to Marx, is going to come socialism. And when we get together next time, we're going to talk about those contradictions, the contradictions of capitalism, how capitalism works. How is it under a capitalist system, according to Marx, that I get you to work for me and not for yourself? It's going to be a little different than the way it was accomplished under feudalism and under slavery. Okay. So until then, I will see you. All right. Take care now, y'all.